Good morning, all, and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion. Possibly the coolest discussion in town, depending on how you're looking at it. This week, obviously, whilst we've melted in the heat, data has become the hottest part of the country as they collate minute by minute how hot the country's been, so they can predict what's likely to happen in the future, and that includes what happens with our health, the economy, inflation. So data's been used for years and years to help predict all sorts of things, but what we've got to think about now here in recruitment is why we're not using data to really develop our business, because potentially it's that gold mine that's beneath our feet that we're not doing. So here's some stats. While times have changed, it seems that old habits are still prevailing. So typically in the sales routine, many still allocate too much time to manual data entry and prospecting. They also spend a lot of time emailing and scheduling calls instead of actually getting in touch with their potential clients. So since 2019, we've seen a massive shift. Sales teams are now putting more emphasis on optimizing their sales efficiency and cutting down the amount of time they spend on the customer cycle. Moreover, what they're doing is they're looking at how they can convert sales. But what's interesting, the sales conversion rate across industries on average, and this is for a new sale, is between 2.4 and 3.2%. Wow. Digital sales, however, have become a trend where 70% of all sales professionals conduct more video meetings. Sales agents spend only a third of their time actually speaking to prospects. And the top priorities of companies that are improving their ability to communicate value to their clients. And that's improving their productivity of their sales team by 65% and increasing their business with existing clients by 64%. But what it's actually done is it's improved retention and repeat business and renewals to over 62%. The digital age, having sort of a good product and flashy sort of sales pitch really is not enough nowadays. We've got to start to think about our customers' behaviors and needs if we want to stand out. And that's where data comes massively in. 84% of customers cite good customer service as one of the key factors when buying from a brand. And sales and market research reveal that 79% of all customers prefer an interaction with a salesperson who is seen as a trusted advisor and can add value to their business. So obviously data comes massively part of that. And this is where we start to think about that social media selling and things like that, because we've got to start to just step around of that. The vast majority of the global population say they are connected to sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, etc. 78% of salespeople say they use social media as a selling tool. Leaders of social selling have 51% more chance of hitting their sales quota. That's according to LinkedIn. 31% of B2B sales professionals believe that they are able to nurture deeper relationships through social selling. And businesses have a 40% chance of hitting their goals if they are consistent on their social selling processes. So when we start to think about that, the top priority of marketers is to generate more leads. That came out of HubSpot. 49% of companies report that increasing customer acquisition is their primary objective. And marketing automation, 76% of companies report using marketing automation using the data they are collecting from their own business as part of their sales tool. This week, I'm joined by Heather. Dave is flying his way to the north, to Manchester, and then I think he's in North Wales tomorrow seeing clients as well. Paul is enjoying the nice, cool, sunny weather of Spain, which is quite strange for us to say from there. So Heather, thanks for joining us today. Much appreciated. Let's kick off with a couple of questions that sort of set this up as a tone. Last week we had Neil Carberry on from the REC, and he was using the REC data to help us forecast for the next 6 months in the recruitment marketplace. Why do you think that the SME market is still lagging behind the big players in the recruitment market when it comes to using data as a sales tool?
It's a big question, Howard, and a really interesting opener. I think there are several reasons why the SME market doesn't use data. So I think one of the biggest reasons is because in a small business, often we're all too busy getting on with the day job. So we're all working in the business. And I know we talk about this all the time about working on the business and not in the business, but very often in a small organization, we just don't have the manpower that the bigger organizations have to have somebody who's focused on data, who's has somebody doing that side of the business. And so I think there's a perception that it takes a lot of time and we don't have the resource to do it. And so there's a knowledge piece around it. We don't know what data's out there, and we don't have the time to go and find out. We don't think we've got time to do anything with the data. We don't have the confidence in our ability to interpret the data. And so I think in small businesses we just don't get on with it because we don't prioritize spending time on it because we don't think it's important. So I think it's a real combination of factors to do with knowledge, confidence, time, ability, access, and maybe there's a little bit of fear in there as well, that we hear about GDPR all the time, and so we're a bit scared of getting into that and what we might be uncovering. So I think there's a whole host of factors that stop people from getting involved in using data.
I think that fear word is probably the most important one that you sort of brought out there, because I when I first sort of thought about the questions, that's the first thing that came into mind. It's the fear, and it's not so much the fear of using data, it's the fear of having to extract that data and then create something using that data. And that says that people have a lack of trust of the data that they're putting into their CRMs, and a lack of trust of the data that they're getting hold of, and whether they see the value in that data. And some of that is because their systems aren't, inverted commas, really fit for purpose, and we've got that horrible syndrome, we've always done it this way, so we'll carry on doing it this way, and we don't see the advantage of what data actually brings to the organization when we start to push that data out. And it's interesting, when I started to read the marketplace and sort of look at what how people were using data, and there was a reason why I gave stats about marketing rather than stats about data, because it was the marketing, they were saying they're using this data, and it's the data that's driving the sales for people, because it's the data that's capturing the client's mindset on how they can use that data to improve their capabilities to attract and retain candidates, but also about how they can improve their EVP, how they can improve their recruitment process. So I think there's a lot of things that sort of is in play, but I think the big thing is that word that you said there is fear. I think we lack the the confidence is a word, that we lack confidence in actually extracting that data from our system, believing what that data actually is telling us, and then going out and telling clients what that data can do for them, whether it be to change a process, move a process, etc., etc., etc. And I think that is the problem that we've got. And as soon as we've overcome that fear and start to see what data can actually do for us, then we probably find that consultants will be far happier putting data in. And it's interesting, on the slide I brought out, this was a slide that came from HubSpot. Which social media platform does your company use? And if you start to look at that, Instagram, Facebook are 83% of companies use Instagram, 80% of companies use Facebook, only 41% of companies use LinkedIn. But that's the main area that most of our companies talk about, is LinkedIn. And we've been keep saying, and I know the REC were quite categorically stated, Facebook is the biggest candidate database in the world, and yet most of us are ignoring it. And again, I think that's part of fear. So when we're working with clients, why do you think the SME market, or how do you think the SME market can create better data sets?
I think we have to start to understand how powerful the data is that we have in our organization, and how much data there is available to us. So we have to start believing this stuff ourselves. So it's starting to create that confidence to say, do you know what, we've got data. And if we haven't got data, why haven't we got data, and what data could we find, and what might we use it? So, if it was me in it running, well, obviously I am in Jump, but if I was running a small recruitment business, then I'd be sitting down with my teams and maybe with my clients, my best clients, and saying, what data might we have that might be useful to you? What data do you use to make decisions? What can I provide for you? What service might I provide with the data that I've got? And so my starting point would be to have a dialogue with my team, with my own recruitment specialists, and then with my clients, excuse me, recruitment specialists, to start to understand what data is valuable, what data should we focus on, and then think about, okay, so if that's the case, then how am I going to do that? So start to make a plan for a data strategy. Start to think about what data you've got, what data you need, and start to spend some time focusing on this particular area. And the big corporate I work for, and I know it's not the same because it's a big corporate and we had resources, but honestly, the pandemic was such a game changer for us as an organization, because as a big organization, we had buckets of data, but we didn't really use most of it. And actually, the pandemic made us focus on what have we got? How can we use it? And we put something called Power BI in, which enabled us to bring data sources from lots of different places and then create dashboards to allow people to view it. And so we put project teams together to really think about what have we got? What can we use it for? What's valuable? And to start these kind of conversations going about it. And it became a real game changer for us in the way in which we used data and we displayed data. And I think on a much smaller scale, the same process works really well in all organizations. So you've just got to start by talking about it. You've got to start by thinking about what have we got, but with the premise that, crap in, crap out, right? So if we're not getting our consultants to use our CRM properly, then the data we've got in it's going to be crap, right? So then the data we get out is going to be crap. So that is an absolute truism: crap in, crap out.
Yeah, so I think the technical term I think is giggo in, giggo, garbage in, garbage out. Yeah. So if we look at that, I think you're right. We have so much data coming in, so we need to determine which data is useful to our clients, which data is useful to our employees, and which data is useful to us as a business. And so you're right. Asking our clients, asking our candidates, asking our consultants is the first place that we need to go at. But we cannot simply think as data as a tool to increase sales leads or our sales capability. We need to use data to develop our own sales capabilities and develop our own processes. And I think this is where we need to start to think, if we can improve ours and our clients and our candidates' recruitment processes, then surely we'd start to become slicker, faster, and better at recruitment. So, if I said take a simple piece of data, everyone sort of measures their job to fill ratio and look at that job to fill ratio. But if we knew the percentage of the jobs that we filled, and then we'd be able to focus on the highest percentage jobs that we fill, surely our consultants' time would be better affected than not working jobs that we would never fill. But that also means that we can go to the clients and talk to the clients and say, on average, this job has got a 23% chance of being filled. This job has got an 80% chance of being filled. And we can start to talk to clients why that percentage is. That goes back to that point where they talk about being a trusted advisor. And that was one of the points that came out in the data set, that if you are a trusted advisor, clients are more likely to listen to you. So giving them actual evidential proof of what's actually happening in the market and the percentage opportunities they have to place with people starts to give you that trusted advisor status. But in your consultants, it stops your consultants hiding really behind those pure, poorly qualified jobs or jobs that they never think that they put them on their sales pipeline. But full well, looking at the data, that job is never going to get filled, or it's a 10%, 12%, 13% chance, rather than the jobs that they've pulled. And sometimes we get masked by the amount of types of jobs that we get in one set. We might get a big set of jobs. And I did this with a client a couple of months ago back in West Yorkshire. And we went and broke down all their clients and every single job that they've ever taken. And it was interesting. The job that had the heaviest number had one of the lowest percentage fill rates, but where one of the jobs they were getting round about an 80% fill rate was a job they'd never thought about chasing. It was just jobs that come out from clients. However, the fee was $3,000 heavier on the smaller job. they've now started to chase those smaller jobs and look for those smaller jobs. And guess what? They're making more placements in those smaller jobs, increasing their average fee, etc. All because they've been swamped with a certain type of job that wasn't particularly filled. They've gone back to those clients, though, and told them why. And some of those clients have now changed the way that they recruit, and they're getting a bigger fill rate there. So just simple one piece of data, that job to fill ratio, can lead to so many things. But are we using it in that way, or are we just using it to bash someone on the head and say, your fill rate is 2 out of 10, your fill rate is 3 out of 10. How do you make it 4 out of 10? And this is the bit, how do you make it 4 out of 10? But then how do you make your clients understand it so you become a trusted advisor? We think of a reason.
The counter to that, sorry, Howard, the counter to that is actually using that same data internally as you're developing your consultants. So as well as developing your relationships with your clients with that, I think it actually feeds into the way in which you train your consultants. So I think there's a huge piece about the use of data in how you develop people, what you focus them on, how you set their KPIs, how you target them. All of that data actually is the other end of the client relationship, because if you don't teach your consultants how to use that data, you can't then use it to impact your relationships with your clients. So it's got to have a learning and development aspect to it as well.
Absolutely. So if we think over the recent months and more so over the last couple of weeks, we've been stating that we need to get close to our buying clients because of, if the market does slow down, etc. So if you were to guide a client on what data you should be using to help to get closer to that client, what would that be?
I'm totally distracted by the word exabyte on the slide. 5 exabytes of information created. What is an exabyte? That's a cracker, that is, isn't it?
Well, an exabyte, I was just trying to find out, because I've just found there's a picture there. So an exabyte is obviously a massive amount of data. I can't tell you how big a data it is.
Is that a technical term?
That's a massive amount of data. And Eric would be very happy with my description of that massive amount of piece of data from there, as he was head of Google from there. But if you think about that quote there, 5 exabytes were created between the dawn of time and 2003. That's now getting created every 2 days. Wow.
It's an astonishing fact, isn't it? I was learning about how SEO works and how Google Analytics works and all that on a development program that I was on to do with marketing. And I had no idea how often Google take a total imprint of all the data that is on the internet, like everywhere. And they, because they use it for Google Analytics and they use it for deciding their algorithms. And I mean, it's just astonishing, the idea that everything has been archived multiple times. Everything. It's an astonishing amount of data. So, yeah.
So looking at that data, if you were to guide a client on what data they should be using, what weight data would that be?
Right. Well, while I'm being distracted by that, you can take that question to start.
All right. Okay, fine. Okay. So I think when we start to look at that, if we start to look at data and we start to look at that, I'm going to look at it from the recruiting side first and foremost. Okay. Data's essential to make effective decisions, and therefore as a sales decision, we need to make a direct response to market changes and our customer changes. And therefore, if we start to use data properly, we can start to identify the ideal customer, or we can start to identify the ideal job, as I've just said. So if we start to look at the ideal company, it's the company you'd most likely want to work with, that you can sell your products to, that is easier to work with the most. And so if you start to identify those types of clients, then you can start to have very targeted business development. If we then start to think about then what we do with that data, if we start about enabling effective prospecting, so cold calling isn't dead. Whatever everybody thinks, cold calling isn't dead. But in order to reach out and engage with our ideal customer through cold calling, it means that we can start to use data and we can start to use AI to start to warm up our clients before we actually start to sell to them. So it means we can start to look for the ideal job title, the ideal company, the ideal business that we should be looking at and trying to break into. Then we can start to search for those companies. If we then flip that into our sales processes, it's about optimizing your sales process. And I remember with a company that I took over for a while. I had a consultant that would constantly come with me with this biggest, this is my pipeline every single week. And they hadn't got a CRM. And we put a CRM and we put Bullhorn in. And Bullhorn actually, after 6 months, would give you then the time it took to fill every job. So every time he put a job in his pipeline and said he was going to place it that month, I went on and looked at, on the CRM how long it would on average take to fill those jobs. And everyone that was over that end of that month, we took out. And then we could accurately predict what he was going to do. And we were accurate within £500 every month for about 3 months. He then got to understood that what he was doing is just giving us complete BS on what his capabilities were. But what it did was it enabled to optimize our sales process, because every client that we looked at that had a long sales process, we looked for the bottlenecks, we looked for the pinch points within their processes. And we started then to break those pinch points down and start to go back to the client and tell them how they could recruit in a better way that would increase their capability of attracting and retaining candidates, but reduce their overall cost of recruitment. So it was about optimizing the value of the sales, optimizing the lead generation that had been done before that, and creating a better process that shortened the sales cycle, aligning the sales cycle to our goals, to our marketing goals, and to our client goals. And that's where it came from. And to me, then, where your sales data collection comes from. It was interesting. You were talking about, collecting it here and there. The more silos you have, the harder it is to collect those data. So you should really try keep it into a single silo and drive it from there. But to me, that's what I'd be looking for. I'd be looking at, can it identify your ideal customer? Can it identify your ideal candidate? Can it create better prospecting? Can it optimize your sales process from there? And then where you collect your data becomes really important. And that could be from public data areas, private areas, etc. But it will give you the opportunity to focus on a market where you should be making money, rather than having your consultants work on clients and in markets that are not making the money.
And what I think is really interesting, listening to that, Howard, is the process that you went through to get there. And I think there's something valuable for our audience to think about in terms of the process. So, it's sitting down and thinking about, what data have we got? What data are we collecting? How useful it might be. And it's starting that debate about the data we've got, how we're collecting it, how we're using it, what value it could be, what decisions it can reinforce with us, and taking that decision to make decisions based on data. And for me, that's the game changer, actually, is that process of starting a conversation about what we've got, how we get it, what we use it for, and to have data in decision making being central to the process. I think it's quite interesting. And in listening to you just describe how that worked and the outcomes you've got, that process is something that even small organizations can absolutely replicate.
Yeah, and most of that data that we were using then was from it wasn't anything that we asked Bullhorn to recreate for us or develop on top of, etc. It was in their natural suite of data that they were bringing back to us. It's just how you manipulated that data and how you then used that data and what you saw from that data. And that means that sometimes you've got to get beyond, what's your fill rate, what's your CV ratio rate, etc. When you're starting to look at it, you've got to look at the advantageous side of it to make sure that you're actually pointing your consultants in the right direction to give them the optimum opportunity to make the most sales humanly possible. What we do is we point them in the right direction, and they then come back and tell us what sales they're going to make. And we never evaluate really whether they're going to make those sales or not. We just go, yes, that's your pipeline, and we believe you're going to lend 25% of that pipeline. Great. Until you start putting a bit of maths behind it,
it's
and
rigor, isn't it? It's rigor behind your decision making.
It's a great company. We've been using that word for the last couple of months now, rigor, because it's a great word. And you're right. It's to get. I think it's not so much about rigor. It's about creating the momentum of the company and creating the rhythm of the company. So if you're working on poorly qualified jobs, then your rhythm's going to be really slow and poor and boring. But if you're working quick jobs that you're getting turned around fast, then your rhythm's going to get quicker and quicker and quicker. And that's what we want. We want people to look at that and drive that. So So we start to think about where you store data, and storage of data is one thing. Extracting data in a usable format is another. We all hear the consultants who hate using the CRMs, etc., etc., etc. So how do we improve this process so it becomes easier and more advantageous for our consultants so we can use that data to help improve their performance?
So I'm not entirely sure that this is what you're after in this question, Howard. So, but my first thoughts on this area are the three things that I would be doing. The first thing is I'd be talking to the software providers of all the systems that I've currently got, so that I understand what data is being held. And so I would go back to all of the providers of all of my software, and I'd get them to come and explain to me what it is I've got and how I access it. Because I know I've worked with systems in the past where actually there were ways of getting data out that I didn't understand. Because not all software providers provide great after sales. Once they've sold it to you, then that's it, they disappear. So going back and demanding to, and even paying for some support to understand what you've got, for me is a really important thing. And the second is to look with my consultants about what we're putting in. So do our consultants understand what they should be putting in, how they're storing the data and why it's important, so that we are dealing with the inputs. I would also look at, there are a load of tools on the market that enable you. Power BI is the one I know. There are, actually my son works for a company called Alteryx, and they specialize in bringing data from lots of different sources and bringing it all into one place. So I would look at what's on the market that you could really simply pull data from all the different places you store it, because you've got it in your payroll system and your CRM, and you might have it in some marketing systems. So how can you pull all of that into one place? And the other thing I actually would look at as well is buying some consulting from overseas, actually really cheaply, finding a data analyst or who can do some of this stuff for you. It doesn't have to be expensive if you buy that support from overseas and actually bring somebody in who can help you do it. And look at some consulting around it. So I don't know if that's what you're going for, Howard, but those would be my instant thoughts on that question.
And I think they're all valid. We've talked about this in the past, and we just mentioned it then about the number of silos that we store data in is huge, and we don't sort of understand where all our data is and how to collate it all together and use it. We need to develop, as you said, how that data is collected, and whether that's automation or manual. And this is where, as you said, your CRM, any systems provider comes into play. How do you collect that data? How do you get it out? And they might not have to develop anything for you, because really their own data set should be already pulling that for them. I mean, Bullhorn give you loads of information about what's happening in the market, and they're pulling that generically from everybody's systems and how that looks. So we've got to think what we can automate. And if you think about what could I automate when downloading a CV that is required for my data set? And if we can automate that, then great. Then we start to think what should be mandatory. So if we're putting a CV onto a system or a client onto the system, and there has to be a manual intervention, what should be mandatory and what shouldn't be mandatory? But they've got to understand why it's mandatory and what's going on and what the use is. And if we then think, potentially, as you said there, you could outsource this. I thought this could be a potential full-time role for a data analyst who can create data sets for you. And this doesn't have to be, the big data analysts where you're getting paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to analyze data. Exactly. This is a simple data analysts that work from there. And it's how you do that. And that means that you can provide great data sets to your clients, your candidates, and your consultants in order to be successful. And I think this is where the big players have that advantage, because that is what they do, is they absolutely look at the data and look at what's going on within that data.
I actually think you can look at internships as well. It's a great job to have a student who wants work experience come and look at your data sets, and can they produce anything interesting out of it. I've worked with Coventry University's London campus. They're always looking for placements where you can get MBA students for 13 weeks to come and work on a project. That doesn't cost you anything. You just got to give them the access to your data and set them going on a project. I'm sure other universities and colleges would have those sorts of people available to do that for you. at no
So,
cost.
so it's interesting. When I remember working for Adecco and Robert Half to some degree as well, they measured all sorts of information and not just salaries or rates or changes. So what data do you think would give the SME recruiter an advantage?
I'm going to go full HR on this one, Alan.
Oh.
Actually, I really like some of the diversity data that's out there, and that when the last APSCO and the REC did some work together on looking at diversity, equity and inclusion data, and very, very few recruitment businesses are collecting diversity data. I actually think there's a massive opportunity because so many clients are crying out for that information that I think that's an area where you could create a unique position for yourself. Not many recruiters are doing it, and not as many as should be, and I think there's a massive opportunity. So I know that's the full HR answer, but genuinely I think there's a niche around diversity data that we should be exploiting.
So to give you a tip on that, because it's an interesting comment and it's one that lots of people are going to stick their head in the sand in because it's so hard to get.
Yeah.
However, there are companies out there like MC who produce data of what the diversity set is within each marketplace. So it might say, set A is 25%, set B is 50%, set C is etc. So when you start to put your short list or long list together, you can start to say that you are beating in this area the diversity quota compared to the national average. So it's not hard to create a really good diversity set in that situation. But to me,
honestly, people are talking about this stuff, but they're not doing it.
Yeah, because
I really think there's a unique place for recruiters to make a difference in this, to make themselves stand out from the crowd by actually doing something useful for clients rather than just talking about it and putting a few pages on their website.
It goes back to that fear, and we've always done it this way. We're not prepared to look at a different way of doing it. And to me, if you simply identify the ideal customer and the ideal candidate, that we know we've got a higher percentage chance of filling or placing that role, that means that we can start to tell your consultants at a glance, where their pipeline is going to come in or not, what their biggest fill ratio is or not. Would you improve the numbers of deals per month? Of course you would. So if you knew the percentage of chance of taking a candidate to market, because obviously we talk about clients coming in, but if we got a candidate that came into our office now and we interviewed, etc., and I suddenly looked at my stats and said, I've got a 25% of chance of placing this person, would I spend a day marketing that candidate out? Possibly not. But if I got a candidate 75% chance of placing, I'd spend most of that day getting that candidate marketed out to the right clients. So it means that I can generate time that's going to be more advantageous to us. And so if we start to sort of move on to that attraction and attrition rates that clients want, then could we use this information to help clients build a stronger culture alignment, give them reasons why their retention is so important? If we could help them create a better EVP, would this combine then to help the client reduce their overall costs of recruitment? So we've got to start to think that information that we talked about in question 1 is relevant, but only to each individual client. And then how we then push that data out into the marketplace as a marketing tool then becomes an advantage, because you can start to say, clients in this market on average, this is what happens. Clients in this market on average, this happens.
And for me, that's about that dialogue we talked about right at the beginning. So you can come out with some basic data, but then you use it as a tool to start conversations with clients about, what can I provide you with that will help you meet your goals? And it's starting that dialogue of how do you build that deeper, stronger partnership by sharing some basic data and then discussing what they're going to find useful, so you can then go back and present it to them in a way that's useful to them.
So what we're saying then is, and what we've sort of thought about then is, if we understand what data our system can produce and we mandate through our staff the reasons why we want it to be put on our system in real time, because that's another thing that you see that, how many times do I see this? How quick can you make a placement? Well, my average placement time is 5 minutes. Oh, right. Okay. Because you put the job on, then you put the CV on, then you put the interview on, then you put the placement on just to comply with your system rather than actually put it on in real time and doing it there. So if we actually put the data on the system in real time, what can that give us and what can that help us with? And that's the bit where we start to think about what we've spoke to today, using your data, using your sort of systems providers to tell you what data they can pull from that, and then going to your clients to find out what data is important. Then you can prioritize which data and then get your consultants to understand why it's important and how this will improve their capabilities of making more placements, and therefore they should be happier to do that. So we spend a lot of time speaking to the SME market, and I think there's a marked difference between them and the big players. The SME market tend to court the recruitment line and speak to the line that is recruiting, where the big players spend an awful lot of time talking to the C-suite and the people who are actually signing the checks and signing the bigger deals off. Why do you think, or could you give me a reason why changing our approach in using data could help open the sales channels to the C-suite, and why that's important to our SME market?
I don't know why any organization would not want to prioritize communicating with the C-suite. I think if you're going to build stronger, deeper relationships with your clients and you're acting as a consultant, having your relationships at a hiring manager to recruitment consultant level is just unsustainable. So the minute you lose that recruitment consultant, you've lost the relationship. If your relationship is, or if the hiring manager leaves, your relationship's gone. So having those frontline recruitment consultant to hiring manager relationships is just very narrow, very short term. And if we're moving to longer, deeper, stronger consulting relationships, they have to move up the hierarchy in your organization and in your client organization. So you're way less vulnerable to losing your relationships if you've got a web of relationships in your client and a web of relationships across your organization than if your relationships are dependent on a single consultant in your business and a single hiring manager. And I know Howard will have as many examples as I do of where that has gone hideously wrong for organizations, where they've suddenly realized it's all vested in a single relationship, and overnight that relationship can disappear from both ends. So in terms of why, it absolutely has to change. It's about being sustainable in your recruitment. So that the why, I think, is pretty straightforward. In terms of how you use data, I think it is about that dialogue piece of understanding what is your client trying to achieve, what are your client's pain points, and how can the data you have help your client meet their objectives, how you can use data to help them create their own internal burning platforms. If you're dealing with a HR director who's looking at her own KPIs and what she's got, and she finds a recruitment partner who can give her the data to demonstrate to the board why she's meeting her own KPIs, she's way more likely to build a strong relationship with you because you're helping her meet her goals. So I think understanding your C-suite, your senior managers' goals, motivations, pain points, and then using the data that you have to help them meet their own individual goals just helps create that sustainable web of relationships. It's understanding their own burning platforms.
So I talk a lot about level selling. So selling to levels, director to director, recruitment line to recruitment line, etc. And that's about having more than one point of contact within the business that controls the business, just in case your consultant leaves. You should never have a consultant who is the sole point of contact in your big clients, because
how many times have we seen that mistake?
I see it constantly. So what we start to think about is, if you start to think I remember in 2008 when the big financial crash happened, and instantly we started to think about retention is the best strategy here of our clients and how we build that. And I remember being sent on a Miller Hyman course about how to develop clients and how to build clients.
Yep,
and it was really interesting when they said, here are your threats in your business. And I'm thinking, right, I've got threats. Here's my outside threats from competitors, etc. And they went through threats. The managing director, the CEO, the FD, the HR director, the IT director, the finance director, etc. So anybody that had any power was an instant threat to you as a supplier into that business. And it was about what relationships are you building with those people and how are you building with those people. And it was starting to understand that you have a different conversation at the recruitment line because you talk about how you're going to recruit, but at the C-suite line, you start to talk about how you're going to save money or how you're going to increase retention, attraction, etc. within the business. So it's a very different conversation. And back then in 2008, they were talking about using data about, the average tenure of somebody is this duration in your marketplace. If we recruit in this fashion, the average tenure is this. This will reduce your overall cost of recruitment by this %. And it was having that type of conversation with the C-suite and with the, major players within the businesses that made a huge difference to our business, as in Computer People at the time, retaining some of our big clients. And in fact, quite a lot of our big clients, we grew a market share in those clients because we didn't realize exactly how much we had and what their capabilities were. And, it's having the gumption to go up the line and speak up the line because that's what controls the business. And I think that approach is very different. And sometimes as the SME market, we're happy to have those big clients and we're happy to speak to the recruitment line. We're not happy to create a way further up the line because we don't think we've got the capability or we don't think we've got the kudos to speak to the C-suite line. But if you go with something that will help improve their business, they will be listening to it.
Yeah.
So
this is the Miller Hyman, the latest version of the Miller Hyman book, exactly on that. If anybody is interested in thinking about that, if you contact me, I'll send you the details. But it's not a massively thick book, but it's not amazing about creating those long, deep relationships and to becoming a consultant partner.
And if they're still using the blue sheet, they'll probably have a version of the blue sheet in there and how that blue sheet should look, unless they've now taken it online.
Yeah, the blue sheet, strategic selling. They have a gold sheet for this one. It's called a gold sheet.
Gold sheet now. We've gone gold. There you go.
Gold, yeah.
That shows how out of date I am on the Miller Hyman stuff. But there you go. but it's all about the same thing. So here's the last question to finish off then. We talk about creating prospect to prospect relationships. We know that clients treat us mainly like a suspect because they don't see the value in our business. So to create a prospect to prospect relationship, it's got about giving them something that they can use. So is data the new band of gold that we can give to clients that would enable us to create a stronger prospect to prospect relationship, and therefore we'll be able to take more market share or more wallet spend out of that client?
And I think my answer to that is potentially. Yeah, so potentially. So I think that all of us have that goal of creating prospect to prospect relationships, and anything that we have that can give our consultants the confidence to value themselves and to value their service has got to be a good thing. And potentially the data that we hold in the organization, if it's part of a dialogue of moving our relationship on to acting like consultants and moving our relationship away from that transactional piece, then I think data absolutely could be the new band of gold, but not in isolation. So just rocking up with a spreadsheet is not going to hack it. So it's got to be about having that dialogue, understanding what you've got, understanding what they want, and how we use that to create that longer, deeper relationship.
So I think it's interesting that when I was sort of digging through to try sort of create the slide select for this today, it came across Dan Heath, data are just summaries of 1,000 stories. Tell a few of those stories to help the data meaningful, make the data meaningful. And I think, when you start to think about selling to clients, we use data quite a lot subliminally without actually knowing where we're pulling that data from. We use data at the start of every single webinar and driving every single webinar. And, it's interesting when you start to think about that 58% of marketeers would put webinars as their biggest driver of leads. Now, we understand that and see that. So even webinar people are using data and to build a company, and I think when you start to build a prospect to prospect relationship, bringing data that clients can use to either improve processes, reduce costs, or make attraction and retention longer is absolutely worth its weight in gold to that client. But it's how you present that data. And what you say there, it's not just turning up and saying, here's a spreadsheet, it's how you present that data. And if I go back to CP days, I remember doing, every year we'd bring out a coffee table magazine, which was about 2 inches thick, of the salary surveys in the marketplace. And we would have breakfast seminars and we would go out and present it. I remember presenting in Edinburgh at a breakfast seminar, and I think we had 70 clients in a room, just because they wanted to hear what salaries were doing and how salaries are moving. And that's the simplest part of data that we've got. Just think how much more data we could now encapsulate from our CRMs and other areas that we silo our data in that could really drive a stronger, deeper relationship. And that is, to me, is what we should be thinking about when we think about data and using it. It's using it from a marketing, sales point of view, but it's also using it as a process development point of view as well. And look at we can work from there. So that's it this week, ladies and gents. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we start a complete new series of webinars. Next week, the topic is building high-performance teams. Is your team structure a catalyst to performance? And I think as we start to hit the second half of the year, we've got to start to think about our performance, because obviously, if there is a recession coming or we're heading towards a flatlining in the market, as Neil was saying last week, okay, having a high performance sales team is really important, and looking at how that sales performance is created and generated is absolutely paramount to your success in the second half of the year. So I'd like to thank you for your time, Heather. Thanks for your input, much appreciated. As always, ladies and gents, thanks for your time. Thank you that the heat has finally started to abate somewhat, and I'm now no longer in my little oven. I shall see you all next week.
Bye.